Hey everybody, welcome back to another edition of Press Fix, the official JournoDAO podcast. I'm Eureka John from JournoDAO, and we have Spencer, aka Clinamenic from JournoDAO, and we have Devansh, the founder of Voicedeck, with us today as well. And we are going to be talking about some really cool topics today regarding public goods, venture capital, regarding funding sources, regarding certifications using blockchain, and all types of other fun stuff. So I'm really looking forward to this episode. Let's go ahead and get started. I will have Spencer and Devansh also come up onto the stage here. And let's just say a brief little bit about who we are and why we're here.
Yeah, I'll go first. I'm Spencer, also Clinamenic, one of the founding members of JournoDAO. Been working with Eureka John and a few other JournoDAO founding members for the last couple of years, trying to identify what the major pain points in the journalistic industries there are about decentralized storage and censorship resistance, and how some new technologies like web3 and certain peer-to-peer infrastructures can perhaps provide some solutions to those problems. And a great part of this conversation that we've been having over the last couple of years is how to sustainably procure funding for public goods if we want to create tools for journalists that are free to use and accessible to people and are essentially constitute public goods like digital public infrastructure. How can we sustainably go about funding without that entailing extractive business models? And so hopefully that's what we'll get into with this conversation around public goods. And yeah, Devansh, do you want to introduce yourself and what you're doing with Voicedeck?
Yep, sure. So I started as a journalist. So this is 7 years ago, before my Web3 life. It's almost like a religion, before I got converted to the gospel.
Yeah. Before you were born again, yeah.
Yeah. So, and I spent like 2 years in my master's kind of investigating airlines in Azerbaijan. And I managed to track down its assets and who was owning it. And it turned out to be owned by the Azerbaijan dictator, one of his daughters. And it was also getting contracts from the Pentagon and a loan guarantee from the US. So there was this like really interesting story about how the US was funding an airline with military contracts, and it turned out to be owned by one of the dictator's family. So this created some waves after it got published. It kind of, the CEO like stepped down after that. Like while I was reporting it and emailing him the questions, he kind of stepped down over there. It got calls for US Congress to investigate. This was all like kind of related to the Panama Papers. That was the same time I was in school and my professors were doing it. And there was no business model for that. Even after they created such huge impact, they were still going around getting grants from different funders. So that really made me think that, hey, this journalism is creating very quantifiable outcomes, like someone resigning or like asset seizures, court cases. But they obviously don't have eyeballs. There'll be very few people who read such a detailed investigation. So you can't, and it takes 1 year to do it. So even if you get a lot of eyeballs, it's still not enough to kind of break even in the eyeballs you need to recover the cost of the story. So I really saw the full market failure that existed for investigative reporting. And that's when I started going down, hey, let's look for a business model, because that would unlock a lot of structures. And eventually I found my way to Web3 after 5 years of barking down the wrong tree. And I'm really hopeful that this attempt which you're making now will unlock new funding sources for the reporting that transforms and doesn't just inform.
Yeah. Thanks for that. We're definitely looking to help journalists find ways to go down the investigative journalism route once again and find the sources of funding. And like you talked about, this weird source of funding for an airline, would that be a public good? And I think even the word public good's gotten a little convoluted nowadays, and so it might help to just kind of like reel it in and just redefine what a public good is, and just to set the stage for everybody, if you could take that one.
Yeah, so the way I think about public goods is is very like mathematical, which is that public goods is equal to value creation minus value capture. So value creation is things like, okay, your story which is published, it creates value in the form of holding your representatives accountable. Like, why did you give this contract to the airline? It's value creation in the form of actual lawsuits being filed against that, and the contract being cancelled, and like society's laws changing as a result of it. So that's all value creation. But how much of that value is actually captured by the journalists or the media outlets that helped kind of kickstart this entire process? So whenever you see a disparity between value creation and value capture, that's where the role of public goods comes in. And you can also have the reverse case, like something like finance, which manages to capture a lot of value, but how much value do they create? And like then you have a disparity the other way as well.
I really like that approach you're taking about value creation minus value capture. I think that's interesting. Like, if the value that's created by something is like proprietary or owned or kind of gate kept, then is it really a public good? I would be inclined to argue no. And I think it's also useful for anyone new to the concept of public goods. It's an economics term, and the two main like qualifying traits of it are non-rivalrous and non-excludable. So in economics, I gather the term public good refers to assets or resources that are non-excludable and non-rivalrous. Non-excludable meaning they can't be gate kept, like they're open for anyone to use. And non-rivalrous means that there isn't like some fixed sum that people are competing to get access to. And so, like, depending on how strict you want to be, and depending if you want to use this literal economics definition or if you want to broaden it out, I think it could be useful just for a sense of context of the history of that term for anyone who's new to the concept. But I really like the way that you're thinking about it, Devansh.
Yeah, the whole idea of it, kind of like a math equation, really kind of puts a very objective viewpoint on it. I like that a lot. Public goods, seem to be something that a larger entity makes, I guess, a governmental, and it's not even a governmental entity, just something that everybody should have access to, like air and water and things like that. And when you have a bunch of people competing for it, then you obviously have the dominant forces taking advantage of that and then excluding other people. And it's almost human nature. Sometimes it seems that happens, and it's kind of making it accessible to everybody. And so I like the mathematical angle of it.
I was going to just double down on that. I think the mathematical angle that Devansh lays out is especially useful for the kind of quantitative evaluation that may go into verifying the impact of certain projects, or if we're tracking this stuff on chain, taking some mathematical angle or trying to look at what public goods are from that mathematical lens, express it in those terms, can make it more easily quantifiable. And I think that's, if we're talking about tracking impact, we're going to need good ways to quantify these things.
Yeah, and as a reporter, you got to have everything be as traceable as possible, which is where blockchain and web3 come in. So there's been a lot of public goods funded by governmental agencies, like you pointed out, Devansh, and VCs. And when I say VC, I mean venture capitalists. Devansh, do you want to kind of quickly give a definition of a venture capitalist? And is there a way that venture capitalists can fund something and have it be a public good?
Yeah, I think that's a very relevant question given the whole fracas around the Optimism Retro PGF round 3, where there are many people upset that the VC funded projects kind of have already brand recognition and value. So that's why they always clear the ballot. Whereas projects which don't have VC money aren't able to get enough brand recognition to even get the minimum 17 votes that they require to clear the ballot. So I think the best take I've seen on this controversy is by Patrick Collins, where he basically says that as long as something is open source and it's not charging a fee, like it's not restricting access only to those who can pay, it's okay if it's VC funded. And I think that's also the position that I come into. Like, even if you look at Gitcoin, I mean, all of us agree Gitcoin is a great public good. But guess what? It's funded by VCs. Like, VCs are the ones who gave that initial capital. It was consensus. So I think, like, kind of, we have to not draw these arbitrary boundaries and exclude. I mean, the whole idea of blockchain and crypto is that we want to be inclusive, and whatever walk of life you come from, it's like, it's a shelling point for the hopeful that we want all of you to come and participate. So I don't like this arbitrary rules that people are proposing, that like VC is bad, and if you've got money from VC, then we don't want you to take part in these new funding structures. I think it should be twofold. One is, are you open, like how are you open and transparent, and are you sharing the code and actually creating value for the whole ecosystem? That's number one, which is really important. And the second is really just what are you going to do with the money if you get it? So I'll give you another example of endowment. So endowment is another philanthropic. It lets nonprofits register, and then you can fund nonprofits in crypto using endowment. So they are also, I think, funded by VCs. But like, so they applied for a grant in Gitcoin, like, on the forum, saying give us $60,000 in the matching pool funds. Gitcoin agreed to do that because they said that this money is being passed on to the nonprofits that they work with. So it's kind of like, okay, even if you're a VC funded money, you can't go tell your VCs that, hey, I want to give the money to the nonprofits that are on my platform. Like, they'll say, no, why are you wasting our money on that? But you can go to someone like Gitcoin or RetroPGF and say, hey, I have all these nonprofits. We need to show them some advantage to being on chain. So I think actually connecting RetroPGF to their funds can help really make clear the value proposition. So it's how you're going to use the money if you get it, and it's about creating value for the ecosystem by being open source and being transparent and sharing your learnings in public.
I totally agree with all that. I'm glad you mentioned the Patrick Collins quote as well. And just for some context for any listeners who aren't familiar with Gitcoin or Optimism retroactive public goods funding, I'm less familiar with the Optimism one, so maybe one of you can explain that a bit more. But for anyone who isn't familiar with Gitcoin, it's to my knowledge, a relatively novel form of allocating funding for public goods projects. And it's similar to Kickstarter in that individuals can donate small amounts to projects. And it's also similar to matching funds, where like if you ever listen to NPR or something like that, where they say, oh, if we reach $10,000 worth of donations, the such and such foundation will match that donation. Gitcoin does something similar where they essentially crowdsource a bunch of its small donations from individual donors, and then at the end of some period of time, depending on all the projects, all the grant projects that are receiving those donations, which amount of donations they have, all of that goes into determining which percentage of the larger matching pool of funds that project gets allocated. So if there's 10 projects that are making public goods and they have grants on this platform and they all get different amounts of donations from individuals, then they all get some different breakdown, some different percentage of the larger matching pool. And the intention is that it's like a smart way to allocate public goods funding. And I think Optimism does something similar, but I haven't used that. So maybe if one of you that's familiar with it would want to explain a little bit about it, if we think that's relevant for listeners.
Yeah, I'm happy to take Optimism and also briefly talk about Octant. So I think Octant is a better segue in terms of public goods funding mechanisms here, because the two biggest weaknesses of Gitcoin, which I see kind of threatening its longevity, the first is the constant need to raise funds for your matching pool. So in Gitcoin, when you vote, Gitcoin matches that funding based on a formula called quadratic voting. So you always need to keep replenishing the funding pool. And the second is like the idea of a Sybil attack, that you spin up multiple accounts and each of those accounts votes for your project in a small amount. So you get to bypass the quadratic tax that you have to pay if you voted all with just one account. So a really neat solution to both of these problems has been done by Octant, OCTANT. So they are part of the Golem Foundation. So they did their ICO in 2016, where they raised 800,000 ETH, out of which they've managed to somehow preserve half of it even now. So what they've done is they've taken 100,000 ETH and they stake them. So that staking results in around 350 ETH every 3 months, which they just distribute to like public goods projects. And the way they distribute it is really interesting, where if I lock GLM token, assume that I have 1% of all the Golem token supply and I lock that 1%. So all the staking rewards, I get 1% of those staking rewards. So the 350 ETH every 3 months, I get 1% of that because I've locked 1% of all the GLM supply. And then I can either choose to claim those rewards for myself or pass them on to public good projects. So where does the matching fund element come in here? So right now, if you look at the most recent round, which Octane ran, they had 15% of all GLM locked up in Octane. So that means 15% of 350 ETH, which they got in the staking rewards, goes to those 15% lockers. But most of them chose to pass it on to public goods projects, which they then matched with 85%, because 85% of the GLM isn't locked. So 85% of 350 went as matching fund, and 15% was the allocators deciding which projects to give their staking rewards to. So it was really good. Like, Hypercerts got 35 ETH from this round. Gitcoin got like, I think 10 ETH in this round. Give it like, it's a very circular funding source, Octane, because the only thing they're really dependent on is Ethereum staking rewards, which are probably not going to go to zero. So it's kind of a win-win for everyone. Like Ethereum secures its network by not just having Lido, but also having Octane and other public good staking mechanisms. The people who are holders of Golem also benefit because now GLM supply is being locked. And you have like a very sustainable public good funding source for the ecosystem. So I think that's really a project I'm really excited about.
That's really cool. I've never heard of Octant. So it's OCTANT.build is what I found, where I found the website that I just showed you guys. Yeah, you find something new every single day in this space. It's incredible, and it's really hard to keep up. Everything's moving at a breakneck speed. So a journalist like yourself just coming into this, and then suddenly people are saying, oh, there's Gitcoin, there's optimism, there's Octant, like just rapid fire with all this stuff. Like, where's the best place to start with some of this public goods funding?
The answer is Twitter. I mean, as much as we criticize it, that's the answer. And so you should just follow some key accounts in the space. So one is Kevin Ovoki at Gitcoin. He tweets about a lot of things. Griff Green at Giveth. These are all like kind of exemplars of the public goods funding space. I also tweet about it. So like you should also follow me. I kind of regularly post updates on some of these new funding mechanisms that I'm seeing.
Okay, that's good. So let's clarify a couple of these terms that you threw out. You threw out, quadratic funding and Sybil attack. So those also are two terms that a lot of people might not understand. And I know it's hard to just kind of quickly define either of those, but you want to take a crack at it?
Yeah, sure. So Sybil attack, I mean, if you look at some of the major problems in Web2, it's that there are too many bots. So even a lot of people, even before Elon Musk took over Twitter, one of the big problems that accounts with a large number of followers had was that when I post something, I have to just keep spending so much time blocking bots, which are kind of giving scam links and other things, which is automated do it. So Sybil attack is like Sybil defense is really a way to actually identify bots and prevent them from participating in the network. So that's at a very high level, kind of what Sybil attacks are. Gitcoin is using it in a fairly unique manner, which is so the way they, like, if you look at matching fund programs, like you said at the start, that, hey, we have, for every dollar you give us, this foundation is giving us another dollar. The issue with those programs is that as an employee or as the founder of that organization, I can literally donate my entire salary, get the matching fund, and then pay back my salary to myself. And there's really nothing to stop that from happening. So Gitcoin is also trying to solve that issue where they have a formula. So if I give $1 to that project gets one vote. But if I want to give two votes, then I have to spend $4. And if I want to give three votes to the project, I have to give $9. So the cost of voting for a project increases quadratically. And I mean, on the one hand, we can think that, okay, like, whales, it's limiting the influence of whales and whatnot. But the perspective that really changed my mind was, no, it's actually allowing people to express the intensity of their preferences. So if you think of a normal election, right, we all get only one vote in it. Even though I might believe very strongly in the issue and you barely care about the issue, we all still get one vote. So how do we actually create a mechanism that allows people to express the intensity of their vote? So if I really believe very strongly in it, I can actually give my entire saved up amount of voting power in one election, So that's kind of how. So it's not about just limiting the influence of whales, which is how people think of quadratic voting normally. It's also about letting people express how intense their preference for something is.
That's really cool, and here's a website I found, WTFisQF.com. WTF is quadratic funding. So if you want to go check that out, it will kind of get you up to speed on that concept. So thank you for taking that little side route with me on that, just to kind of define some of these terms. This is just so much stuff being thrown around in the Web3 world, and as just somebody coming in, it just, I can see why some people get turned off by Web3 and crypto.
Yeah, it can be overwhelming. So I'm glad we're taking this time to talk about some of these concepts and try to explain it from a perspective that isn't just mired in this stuff all day like we are.
Yeah, definitely. I'll just go off into one last segue into optimism retro
Sure.
PGF since I didn't get it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So kind of the mechanism they have is they have, like in this most recent round, they have 30 million OP tokens. So that's around $30 million at today's rate. And how do you then distribute that 30 million to public good projects? So their mechanism is that they have people who are called badge holders. So badge holders are people who are trusted members of the collective. And each of them has 30 million voice credits, or 30 million they can allocate, 30 million OP they can allocate. So they have to actually go through 600 projects. That's how many projects are kind of shortlisted in this round. So all 150 badge holders go through as many projects as they can, and they can say that, okay, this project I want to give 5 OP to, this one I want to give 1 million OP to, this one I want to give my entire 30 million, I want to give it just to one project. And then the amount of money that a project actually gets is determined by the median of all of the voters. So if there are 20 voters, then the amount of money which is given to the project is how much the 10th highest amount allocated by a voter. So it's the median amount that's given. So it's a very unique kind of way. It's like it prevents outsized swings. Like if you use something like the mean, like, okay, all the voters take the average. If one voter said, I want to give 30 million to this project, it would just completely swing the results if you took an average. So by taking the median, they actually make it much more kind of consensus based. And they are quite successful in only funding impact that's happened in the past. So they don't look at impact which might happen or speculative ideas. Sometimes they even tell you that, hey, your idea is too early. Go show us some progress on Gitcoin rounds and get some money there and do something and then come and apply to us. So it's this full pipeline that we are seeing get built up, which is really exciting. And I would just want to, before we move on to Voicedeck and what we are doing there, I just want to draw a contrast to traditional philanthropy. So traditional philanthropy is really an all or nothing game. So either you get the entire $100,000 grant you've applied, or even $10,000. You either get the entire amount or you're left with zero. Whereas with something like Gitcoin, even if you are very new, you're going to get like maybe 5 votes, 10 votes, 20 votes. You're going to get some non-zero amount, especially because most of my votes in Gitcoin come from people who I don't even know. People who are just like, they go through the projects and they vote. And that allows you to build up reputation that, okay, I managed to get $500 in the last round. Okay, I can use that. I can use it very wisely. And then people see that, oh, wow, we actually used that money and did something with it. And then you might get more in the future. And then you can go to other funders and say, hey, I got money from Gitcoin and this is what I did. And then they also might give you money. So just a much lower barrier to entry is one way of thinking about the Web3 space compared to traditional philanthropy, which is very limited.
Oh, yeah, well, one other thing, I'm glad you brought up this opportunity to distinguish this kind of philanthropic funding from traditional philanthropic funding. And one of the important things, for better or for worse, so far with Web3 public goods funding is that there's almost no strings attached whatsoever. Like the Gitcoin rounds we've been a part of, sometimes we've received a couple $1,000s. One of the projects I was involved with got $60,000 over the course of a couple rounds, and there were no strings attached whatsoever. So like in a way that gives a lot of trust and freedom to the nonprofit public goods, or the public goods grantee project to spend that money however they want. But it also can make it difficult to retroactively account for how well it was spent if there aren't like checking in to see how those funds were spent before. And I think that's one of the things that what you're doing with HyperCerts can help solve. But one of the other differences between all of this kind of public goods funding versus traditional philanthropy is the kind of bookkeeping. Like a lot of the times, at least I gather with nonprofits in the US, to get certain tax deductible donations involves a lot of bookkeeping to ensure that you're only using those donations for certain things that advance a nonprofit mission. Whereas in web3, a lot of it is just this wild west of you get this public goods funding without any strings attached, and effectively you can use it however you want, and you're sort of at the mercy of whatever regulations develop down the road. So I think that's another thing to watch here, and how potentially what you're doing with hypercerts can help that accountability that is arguably lacking right now.
Yeah, for sure. It's like adding some layer of accountability in this wild west Web3 world we live in. Just because somebody happens to understand a little bit of the bleeding edge of technology doesn't mean that they can just be dumped a bunch of money on and then just be allowed to just go willy-nilly spend however they want. So it does adds an accountability layer, because like one of the questions that was going to lead to talking about hypercerts and stuff like that was like, I was like, okay, what if somebody they're not wealthy, and they don't have the money to just go and just like do some kind of big public good, and doesn't that put them at a disadvantage and gatekeeps well-intentioned people from getting money? And I guess this layer of accountability, yeah, you'll get there one day, right? But you got to build up to it. You don't start off with, like, for instance, some amazing car. You have to start off with some base model car, then you trade in on your way up to having the top of the line model. It's kind of creating a social graph to help people earn their way up to receiving public goods in a way, right?
I think there's also another side to it, which Scott Alexander wrote about in his canonical piece called Impact Markets, The Annoying Details. So what he writes there is that the larger idea is to separate cause selection from startup selection. So as a foundation, I need to choose the cause I want to invest in, whether that's journalism or environment. And then I also need to choose the team that can execute well. So it's like two functions that I need to serve. So in the larger goal which they want to achieve, impact markets and hypercerts and all of them, is that you actually outsource startup selection to investors, because that's what they're good at, right? That's their bread and butter. They know the teams that can work well and they can help them in the right way. And as a foundation, you just see which impact has been good and you just get that impact. So that's at a larger level how that also addresses your question, that if you're not that wealthy in the first place, like in the ideal version of impact markets that exist, which is we are a far ways away from that. But in the ideal version, like there would be investors who believe in me, who give me money, and then I create impact, and then foundations would buy that impact and some of it would go to the investor. One other thing I'd say about impact markets in general. So Scott Alexander also gave this amazing analogy of what an impact market is. So he said that if supposing I want to go and buy a t-shirt, I have to just go to the market, give money, and I get the t-shirt immediately. Whereas when it comes to impact, it's like I give money and then 6 months later I see the impact. So it's kind of like, how do I recreate the t-shirt market in the social impact market? I think that's the most simplistic way I found of understanding it.
But I also like the way that you talked about the various different public goods systems, funding systems like Bitcoin and Optimism, and how they kind of can form a pipeline where if you're talking about retroactive public goods funding, and the criteria there being that you need some track record of some kind of impact that's going to be retroactively funded. And then the point John made was, well, not everyone is in a position where they can afford to just start doing philanthropic work without any kind of funding from the start. But also from like a funding perspective, you want the kind of accountability. You don't want to be giving funds to teams that you don't think can execute. And so I think it's really interesting the way that you framed this as a pipeline where systems like Gitcoin are perhaps better suited to proactive public goods funding and funding teams to get from 0 to 1 and enabling them to build out that kind of track record, which can then, as they continue that track record and continue making impact, be a basis for later retroactive public goods funding. So I think that's a really interesting way that you frame that as a kind of like a coherent pipeline.
Yeah, I really love the whole pipeline visualization, because it creates like this roadmap of, okay, this catch-22 chicken and the egg problem here. I don't have money, but I want to do a public good, but I don't have a way to prove myself. So, maybe create some kind of chart that shows new people in like where to start. What's the best way? Step 1, step 2, like you said, step 1, get coin. And I don't know, maybe somebody needs to illustrate something like that.
Yeah, I would also add something close to what you had said earlier, John, which was about how organizations have to spend a lot of time on accounting and admin work today. So I think the cool thing about raising on Gitcoin, which I found, is that as valuable or even more valuable than the money has just been the growth in my community. That like when I have to go out and meet mission aligned and like we met because of Gitcoin rounds, right? Like Voicedeck and JournoDAO came to know each other because of a Gitcoin round, the beta round. So it's kind of like that's the value of Gitcoin, that you really find a values aligned community, and that you have to just pitch your project so many times. There are Twitter spaces going on all the time in those 2 weeks. So you have to just keep talking about your project, and that helps you refine your pitch. You get pushback from people saying that, hey, this doesn't make sense. So it helps you refine your idea as well. So it's not a waste of time. It's like you're fundraising, but you're also developing your idea, as opposed to the traditional world where you're like, it's like a separation. This is a waste of time and I should be spending time on impact. So it's kind of like better. It's more fun to raise money in Web3 than to raise it in Web2.
Yeah. So, I mean, Spencer, do you have anything else you want to add, or you want to move on into what Devansh is working on?
I'd say we're ready to move on. I think that's a good amount of context for the whole situation of public goods and the issues involved with funding there. So yeah, I'd say we're good.
I'll start with some of the work I did after graduation. So I became a reporter with the idea of wanting to go to conflict zones. So, become a conflict zone reporter. And I got the chance to spend about 5 years in the Maoist parts of India, so where there's a civil war that's been going on for the last 50 years. So the media outlet which I joined is very unique. It's called CGNet Swara. And they had a model where they're like, we don't want to be the reporters going and like parachuting into that region, like writing what we think is important and then going out. Why don't we create a media for these people? Like, let's bring democracy to the media. So like similar to how everyone can vote, we should let everyone report. And similar to how we have elected leaders, we should have elected editors. So this was like a hugely radical idea, and I was like quite blown away by it. So I spent about 5 years in these villages, spreading a citizen journalism platform where people could submit their stories by either giving a missed call to a number, so then they get called back and they report, or by just WhatsApping their stories to this number, like to the same number. So if you have internet and a smartphone, you can WhatsApp it. And if you don't have internet or you have a feature phone, which is very common in these areas, you can just call the number and report. So they had the stories that were coming in were extremely basic. So things like, I don't have a road in my village, I don't have electricity, the teacher is not coming to the government school, so the children aren't learning anything. And because it was a very sensitive war zone, we would like press to solve these issues, and we would forward them to different government officials, put pressure on them from activists saying that, hey, this villager is saying that the teacher is not coming and taking school. Like, why don't you go and do something about that? And we would see a lot of these problems get solved. So this organization, CGNet, has about 1,500 such impact reports over 10 years, where they say that, hey, this problem was reported on X date, and after it was reported, it got solved within a span of 3 months or 6 months. But what I noticed was that they really struggled with fundraising. I was kind of looking into their fundraising too, and it was really hard because most of the organization doesn't speak English. They all speak kind of native languages, so it's almost impossible to raise money if you don't speak English. That's like the truth of the philanthropic world. So it's like, what better system can we create which is more equitable and more accessible? So that's where I kind of had the thought, looking at, this was around 2021 during the full last bull market and the NFT boom and whatnot. It's like, hey, what if we took these 1,500 impact reports, which are very diligently recorded in their private database, and what if we could take it onto a public database and actually start selling this impact? So when someone buys one impact report, that gives the organization enough money for their next impact report. And you can actually create this virtuous cycle where the organization doesn't have a separation between applying for money and creating impact, because creating the impact reports is also fundraising. So that's kind of how it started off. And I did a lot of exploration in the space, and sometime in January of 2022, I attended an event called Plurality, where I came to know about hypersearch for the first time. So hypersearch was exactly what we were looking for. It was really like a match made a match made on the blockchain, and so it's like a system for recording impact. So a lot of the idea of hypersearch is what they call impact evaluator systems. And I just recently found out the exact meaning of this term, which is three components in an impact evaluator system. There's record, there's evaluate, and there's reward. So we have the recording already being done by these media outlets, like we're partnering with 3 for our launch, which do similar work. We've also evaluated them. So that's something I'll come to in a bit, of how we're going to be evaluating these impact reports. And the last step is rewarding them. So the reward part is where we hope we can take some of these funding mechanisms in crypto, which we talked about at the start of the podcast. We can actually apply it to the real world. I think that's been a big criticism, that all of you guys have this kind of incestuous circle where you're just like funding each other and it's not making any difference in the world. So if we can actually apply these amazing funding primitives that we've got and actually apply them to the real world in some way, I think that can be really impactful. So using Gitcoin QF, Optimism, Retro PGF, Octane staking to actually start buying these impact reports from media outlets like CGNet, that's kind of what we are really that's what we are hoping for. And our North Star, again, going back to my master's thesis at the start, kind of a lot of the journalists I worked with who did the Panama Papers and other things, they all say, like, show us a pilot and then we can commit our reputation to going to this very shady thing called crypto and blockchain. And so this is what our hope is, that we do this pilot, we manage to sell 1,000 impact reports. And once we sell this, then we can go to those media outlets and say that, hey, we did this pilot with citizen journalism. Why don't you now bring your investigative reporting on chain, and we can use similar funding mechanisms there.
And I think another interesting aspect about this that we may want to elaborate on for people who aren't familiar with the technology is that in talking about hypercerts and in talking about this particular kind of evaluation of impact, what kind of track record these projects, these teams have of making impact, all this stuff, all the evaluation, the data itself is stored on public peer-to-peer databases. In this case, whether it's blockchains or similar ones, it doesn't. Those terms aren't as important as it is to convey that the information itself is public and is very difficult, if not impossible, to censor or be taken down. And it's because it's public, it can't be gate kept. Everyone can audit it if it's that transparent. You can see who's providing what kind of evaluations. If you do it the right way, it can then get to the point that John mentioned earlier about a social graph that sort of exists in this kind of digital commons that we can all see and we can all track, we can all watch as new information pours into it, and the social graph becomes more dense and more robust, like easier to rely on it to track impact and all that. So I think that's another important part about this, and this also gets into what we're doing with JournoDAO that we can get into later if there's time. But yeah, I just wanted to see if you had any other thoughts about the importance of having information either on a blockchain or on a similar public decentralized database.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So, like, recently I attended the Global Investigative Journalism Conference. So it's like the premier gathering for all investigative reporters. This was like I was able to attend this because I'm a next billion fellow at Ethereum Foundation. So they kind of fund you to go and represent Ethereum and EVM and blockchain at non-crypto audiences. So they kind of supported me to go there. And the way I explained it after a lot of iterations in that conference, the way most of them had never heard of Ethereum. Some of them, like most of them, had heard of Bitcoin. So Bitcoin still has like way more brand value than like Ethereum. And the way I explained blockchain to them was that it's a public database where you can pay money to add an entry to the database. So everyone instinctively understood that because they all use SQL. So I'm like, yeah, it's like SQL, but you just have to pay some money. It can be a cryptocurrency. That's what it currently is, so that no one can stop you. If the government doesn't want you to publish, you can still do it if it's on crypto. So that's the important part of paying in a non-fiat currency, because crypto is the shady part. Blockchain is good. So that's the way I explained it to them, and that they understood. And they're like, okay, this is interesting. So what public databases are good and useful. So then I go into Ethereum and the differences between different blockchains. So it's really hard to just explain it in one line to someone, because that's how much time you have at a conference, you know.
It's like literally an elevator pitch. You're in the elevator going up to the conference room. Okay, so let me see if I have this right. I'm trying to wrap my head around here. Okay, so you have things that happen in communities that go wrong, and then people that fix it. And then they create like they document how they did it, what they did, and they created an impact report and like maybe how much it costs them to do it. And they turn this in to like a set of authorities. You said CGNet in this case, right? I'm not familiar with impact reports or CGNet or any of this. I didn't know any of this happened. And so they document that this problem has been fixed by this group of people for this amount of money. So what Gitcoin and other type of blockchain communities and public goods communities on blockchain, Web3 communities are trying to do is go to these repositories where these impact reports have been filed and say, hey, we want to see things that have been fixed by who and how much they paid in order to do so we can reimburse them. And then we'll put that impact report and what happened and how much they got reimbursed on the blockchain so it's transparent and everybody can see. So is that about kind of along the lines of what you're saying?
That's a great summation of it, yeah.
All right. And so how does hypercerts fit into that?
Yeah, so hypercerts are the mechanism of converting the impact reports, which are on their private database, onto on-chain, to bringing them on-chain. So hypercerts is the connective tissue. So if you have an impact report that these people solved this, how do you now represent that on-chain? So one option is to go the NFT route. But the other, but like NFTs come with certain expectations that if the project succeeds, the holder will make a lot of money, and that's not necessarily an expectation we want. So hypercerts kind of are really good because they're also 1155 tokens. So NFTs are 721s, which is like every NFT is unique, whereas 1155 is semi-fungible. So it's kind of like a pack of baseball cards where every card is unique in the baseball cards, but it's also all belongs to the same set of baseball cards. So hypercerts are the mechanism for taking a private database of impact on-chain as an impact certificate.
Okay, and I have another quick question. So that's a centralization point, these people putting in these reports, these impact reports to an entity like CGNet. Are you proposing to bypass that centralization point in the future?
Yeah, that's a very complicated thing because like amongst the three media partners, they all have different strategies for dealing with the community. So CGNet doesn't pay any of their reporters. The idea is that no one pays you to vote, so why should you be paid to report your own problems in your own community? You're reporting because your road is broken. You're not reporting because you want money. You want your road to be fixed. So CGNet is quite hardline in that respect. Whereas Gram Vani, which is another partner, they have a system where they pay people, they pay clubs of people. So every village has its own club, and they pay the club, and the club can reimburse costs of its reporters, to travel to the road and other things. So that's like a collective model. And then you have video volunteers, which directly pays its reporters per impact report and per report that they generate. So I think that's something we really don't want to get into right now, to mess up the dynamics of how they work with their reporters. So it's kind of like we would give it to the impact, like through the media outlets, and then the media outlets would spend it as they see fit, generate additional impact reports from this money that they've got, and then file those on chain as like proof of work done with the funds that have been raised.
And another aspect about this, in talking about social graphs, is that if you work with these institutions for them to transition their privately stored impact reports to on-chain public databases, as I understand it, part of how hypercerts work, like anything else on-chain, is you can see who posted what, who deployed the hypercert, or who wrote it. And if we do continue moving in this direction of a social graph where it really, like, we're looking for credibility and who has what sort of history of doing what on-chain, if these institutions are managing the transition or the migration of these impact reports on chain, then it can be done in a way that shows that institution's presence, similar to how, like Ethereum Foundation.com can have like a web presence. Like there's a similar, without needing to get into the details, there's a similar way that kind of naming service can work for Ethereum addresses. And that's what can lead to a social graph. So you can see, like, if one of these, something institution.eth deployed this hypercert, it has some kind of credibility, provided that institution has a reputation among whoever it is that's looking at this hypercert.
Yeah, I think that's great, because the definition of hypercert on their website is that it represents a piece of work and any impact resulting from it. That's the definition of hypercert that they give. And it's really important for the investigative reporting industry, because a lot of them follow kind of what I call a hit and run model. That you, like, even my own story, I'm not kind of immune from this, that I wrote on that airlines and it caused impact. And then I moved on to other stories, right? I went on to this war zone and kind of did it. But like now, when I checked recently, the CEO got reinstated, so that was like a kind of a blow, but like it happens, So, but we don't have any incentive to really follow up and stay with the story. And I think that's where actually the richest change can come to the media industry, where you actually create incentive structures for them to stick with the story. And that's what hypercerts and this new funding model can enable, where you create some impact from your story. A year later, you report on the impact that happened because of your story, and then that allows you to get more money. And then again, 3 years later, you do another retrospective of what happened since then, and that gives you more money as well when you track all that impact. So the right way of thinking about it is that we want to make investigative reporters like insurance salesmen. And like, why do I use this analogy? It's because look at the career arc of an insurance salesman. They work really hard in the first 4 or 5 years, and they manage to get, say, 100 clients. And then after that, they can relax and put their legs on the table, because they just have to renew those contracts to get the same amount of money. So how do we do that for journalism? Where they work really hard, they do this initial corpus of investigations, and then it yields impact over 5 years. And whenever some next impact chain happens, that okay, your story caused an investigation by the government. 2 years later, the investigation concludes and it results in a lawsuit by the government against the corporate. So then, okay, then like the journalist gets some more money, because the next level of impact of court case is filed. The court case gets resolved after a year and it causes an asset seizure. Great, the journalist again gets a little bit more of a stream of money, because it's created a next layer of impact. So I think that's really what we want to do, like create a similar business model for investigative reporting as insurance salesmen.
I love that approach of being able to continue receiving, I guess, some kind of income off of the impact that you've made as a journalist. It definitely would, I guess, motivate a lot more people to really get down to the bottom of the truth of a lot of things.
Yeah, and one thing I would add is that Web3 already has this funding mechanism through airdrops. So if you look at the most recent Celestia airdrop, so Celestia is like is something called a data availability layer, which you don't need to know what that is, but it's super important to our industry and ecosystem. And they launched a token recently, which has massively appreciated in value. So during their initial launch, they looked at people, software developers who had contributed to the Bitcoin database, like to the Bitcoin GitHub repo, to Ethereum's core protocols, because Celestia said, hey, we depend on, like, we are standing on the shoulders of these previous giants. So they should obviously get a share in what we are doing. So that was also it, right? Like someone who worked on Bitcoin and then like left crypto, they could still get the airdrop from Celestia. So in a sense, it was already created for the software developers, like through airdrops. But how do we now extend that to investigative reporting?
Yeah, airdrop hunters. I mean, that's kind of positive and negative, though. I've gotten a few airdrops of myself. I will disclose. Yeah, I remember the 1-inch airdrop and the Uniswap airdrop and all those things that just suddenly appeared one morning. I'm like, oh yeah, because I participated in the very early days of those things, and a lot of people immediately cashed out and they didn't participate for what the airdrop was intended for. And then you see just put in hashtag airdrop on Twitter and you'll see how many spam bots start to infiltrate. Do you think there's any risk of anything like that possibly happening?
Yeah, it's kind of all in how the airdrop is designed, because Celestia only looked at contributors to GitHub repos, which they themselves depend on. So, when they narrowed it down so specifically that it's just software developers who give into this repo, I think they had a lot less controversial kind of things happening from their airdrop. So it's really about how it's designed and who you give it to. And the other good example is Arbitrum. So Arbitrum also had a decent airdrop policy. That's really the short answer of it. There are bad airdrops and there are good airdrops, but it's still a novel funding mechanism. I think that's important to remember.
And I guess part of this that's already been covered, but it could be reiterated for people again new to this technology. The fact that these certifications, these hypercerts, would exist on chain, that they're public, they're permanent unless something disastrous happens with the underlying network. They can receive money retroactively at any later point, and that does incentivize, as Devansh said, it incentivizes the people who did that work to keep following up and to keep showing that, this is what became of the impact that I had. And I really like that insurance analogy. I think that makes sense, because once you've done that work, then it's just a matter of following up and maintaining it. I think that's an interesting comparison.
Yeah, and from a real world perspective, is not real world. This is real world, but a non Web3 world. I used to work as a salesman in manufacturing, and you would go and you would make calls on these customers in your territory, and you'd build up these clients, and then, like you said, you would continue to receive the commission for every purchase order that they placed over time. However, there were some mechanisms that we built in so the salesperson doesn't get lazy and just sit back and not call on their customers after that. You were saying, the hit and run approach. To prevent that, the commission started to wane off if there weren't new additions or product lines or quantity changes or anything like that. Maybe you could build in some of those kind of mechanisms.
Yeah, I think we'd be in a very fortunate position, a very fortunate place if we reach that level, where there's too much funding going to investigative reporters. It's a very nice problem to have.
So, Voicedeck. Let's talk about that one a little bit.
Yep. So I've been very lucky, the fellowship that I got from Ethereum, the Next Billion Fellowship, kind of what they do is they talk to you about what you they're looking for people who are on a quest. And this is something very unique, that they say we don't look for fellows with a good idea. We look for people who are the embodiments of a good story and can inspire other people on how Ethereum can be used to impact the world. So they like my story of being a journalist and then coming in with the idea of funding in a novel way. And the way they help you is that they have monthly calls with you. So they have one-on-one calls with their team. And there are only 4 fellows selected and there are 4 team members. So super personalized. So since they saw that my idea was at a fairly advanced stage of understanding and very specific, they allocated it, they connected me with a team at Ethereum, which just moves from project to project. So they do 3-month sprints and then they move on to the next project. They're called Poland Labs is their name. So Poland Labs chose Voicedeck to work on a 3-month sprint. So they've literally allocated 7 developers, a designer, a product manager to just build out our initial version and take these impact certificates, these impact reports that we have, and bring them on chain. So really what our initial version, the MVP that we're looking at launching by the end of Feb with the help of Poland Labs and the EF team is we take these impact reports up as hypercerts and we create a collection, and we have money from Gitcoin. So we've taken, in the last 3 rounds of Gitcoin, we've raised about $2,500 or $3,000, which is enough to buy 3 impact certificates, 3 impact reports. So from each of our media outlets, we can buy 1 impact report each. So then the question really becomes, how do we choose which impact reports to buy? Because we have a central pool, which is money from Octant and Gitcoin and RetroPGF will all come to one pool. How do we now allocate it to the different media outlets? So the approach we've taken right now is every media outlet gets the same amount of money. So they all get $2,000. So that's kind of pre-decided. but how do we decide which of their impact certificates to purchase first and which to purchase later? So that's where we are actually using LLMs and AI, where we give different case studies of journalism impact to the AI. So the one I can recommend is by Hamilton, called Detectives of Democracy, where he looked at 3 journalism stories and quantified its impact. He calculated the cost of the story and he quantified its benefit. And so we fed these 3 databases to the LLM using something called vector embedding. So LLMs have a very low context window, so they kind of forget very quickly. But the way to increase their memory is by storing it in a database. And whenever you ask the LLM a question, it refers to the database, saying, hey, what story from the database should I pull out to answer this question? So we stored Hamilton's case studies in the LLM in like the vector database, and then we fed it these impact certificates from these media outlets. And then we asked it to rank them against one another, that hey, which impact certificate is like first and which is second and which is third. And then based on the order of the LLM which they give us, we purchase those impact certificates from our central pool of money. So again, it doesn't influence resource allocation. I think that's really dangerous at such an early stage to make LLMs decide how much money to give which media outlet. That's something we definitely don't want to do. So that's why we've already decided from earlier that, hey, each organization is getting the same amount of money. It's just twiddle-dee and twiddle-dum, whether impact report A or impact report B of the organization was taken. I mean, that's not as consequential. So that's our initial pilot that we're looking at launching.
With one question about this process at the stage that you're at right now, I gather a lot of it will be going through however these 3 institutions format their impact reports, and then you have to translate that into the field types available for hypercerts. So there's that in addition to selecting which impact reports you want to do. Is that a key process here? And do these 3 institutions use the same formatting for their existing off-chain impact reports?
No, like not at all. No, they are completely different. And even their tagging architecture is different. So that's why we're just starting with 100 impact. Yeah, like so we are just starting small with 100 impact reports and like giving that, because even for the LLM it's easier. And like some of the human elements in this, so one is we're integrating with an identity solution called Anon Aadhaar. So the Ethereum team called Poland Labs that's helping me, they earlier worked on a project where you upload your government ID and it gives you back a zero knowledge proof that hey, we know that you're an Indian, but we don't know which Indian you are, we don't know who you are, so we know your identity. So we let people who verify their identity with Anon Aadhaar get to vote on different impact reports. And then the LLM takes that into consideration that, oh, wow, okay, that impact report that impact report has got 5 votes. So let's push it up the rankings now. And the other way is also just donations. So if supposing one impact report gets a lot of money from the community, that's automatically ranked higher than other impact reports. So that's kind of how we are trying to bring in the human element as well into LLM rankings, and not just make it this evil AI overlord deciding things for the rest of us.
Okay, so I want to make sure that I have like the ecosystem structure, properly laid out in my head. So you have like Gitcoin, Octant, and Optimism, and other type of Web3 driven public goods communities that people can obscure the funding from, right? And then the hypercerts are kind of like the mechanism, the tissue layer that allow that to happen with the Web2 databases of the impact reports, right? The ligament. And then so the Voicedeck is kind of like like a marketplace where people can shop for those impact reports. Okay, and then they all kind of coexist in the same little ecosystem there. All right.
Yeah.
I'm getting it, man.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Wow, that's great. It took an hour, but we finally got all the elements in. Yeah.
Spencer, do you have any type of summarization of all this, how it fits together for you?
Yeah, I would say for any journalists listening to this who are curious about these public goods funding mechanisms and the state of things right now, a lot of it is still experimental, and a lot of the accounting and the bookkeeping and making sure that public goods funding is being sent to projects that will actually have an impact. A lot of the processes there are still being worked out, and the things that Devansh are working on with Voicedeck and the team at HyperCerts, those are the kind of developments that I think will lead to more accurate accounting mechanisms for all of this. And if anyone listening to this is curious about the talk of attestations that John just mentioned, our previous episode was another hour dedicated to all of that and what JournoDAO is working on. And a lot of it ties into this, and a lot of it has the same concerns and kind of funding circumstances being a public good. And so we talk a little bit about that there. But I think this conversation was great for providing a whole bird's eye view of the public goods funding ecosystem in Web3.
Yeah, like the other thing I would say is that I'm seeing this growing movement towards the idea of on-chain media. So it's like similar to how in the 1990s, no one knew what online media exactly was. Like today, we know its features very clearly, that there's no length limit. You can have video and text in the same story. So all of these, and you can have two-way communication with your audience, not just one way. Your sources can directly reply to a story and contact and add context to it. So all of these features are clear today about online media, but they weren't clear in the 1990s. And the kind of movement is saying that on-chain media is in a similar place, that like there is something to the meme of an on-chain media, but exactly what its features are is still a little unclear. So one of the elements is retroactive funding. So similar to how you can give airdrops based on your past participation, you can give airdrops based on impact from your past stories. And the other thing which Spencer's working on more is around permanent storage of a story, because sometimes it really sucks as a journalist when I've done hard work and my story is there, and then the website gets like, they go out of business, and then I can't send my sample to any editor for my jobs. That really sucks. So I think, Spencer, that's like a great tool that you're building, and you can maybe talk about it a bit.
Sure. Yeah. So the project that JournoDAO is working on right now, which Devansh just mentioned, which we hinted at earlier, is what we're calling PermaPress. And it's a very quick, lightweight tool that would allow anyone, but especially journalists, to upload their content, their articles, to decentralized databases, which are have a lot more longevity than the kind of private databases that are maintained by companies. Because as Devansh said, if a publication company goes out of business, who's to say what's going to happen with their private storage there? And maybe that means your content will be deprecated. That happened to one of the other JournoDAO core members who almost lost a huge chunk of his portfolio because a publication deprecated or changed management. And so what we're building is a very lightweight tool, and by lightweight I mean inexpensive for us to maintain, so that we can actually maintain it as a public good. It's very inexpensive, and it allows anyone to, without getting anyone's permission, to upload their articles and their content to various decentralized databases so that they can access it whenever they want. There's a perma-web link, referring to this notion of permanent online storage that's facilitated by peer-to-peer databases. And then the other aspect of it, which Eureka John just mentioned about Ethereum attestation service, that's just our way of accounting for metadata for those articles. So you can actually search for on-chain little bits of metadata for these articles, like author name or author title or the version of it. And then all these things are just like this web of referencing kind of data points in a knowledge graph, whereas the actual articles are stored on other peer-to-peer databases like Arweave or IPFS. And so we have basically we have a proof of concept MVP version of this done. Major kudos to Keith Axline and JournoDAO, who put together a tool that actually facilitates this. And so from here on, it's just ironing out some of the details, and hopefully it can plug into what you're doing, Devansh, with HyperCerts. So I'm excited to see how those two projects may integrate.
Yeah, that's great. I think once we eventually move on to investigative reporters, I think that's where the integration would happen. Because like with citizen journalism, the impact is quite immediate. The road fell on the tree got cleared up after it was reported, and then like end of story. But whereas for like more far-reaching impact, like talking about like failures in like HSBC Bank and in like money laundering cases, and then that causes like internal investigations in the company, like that's where you would need things like PermaPress to record the initial story, and then hypersearch to record all the impacts stemming from that story. So that's how I see the integration happening.
Yeah, and then something like Ethereum attestation service for everybody else to kind of be a witness to it as well, and then to certify that yes, I was a part of this, or I'm behind this, to add some kind of social credibility to it too. So everything kind of ties into each other.
What's also beautiful about the media sector in particular is the evaluation component. So if you're looking at something like agriculture or environment, you have to bridge the evaluation from the real world and bring it on chain, which is incredibly difficult. Whereas when it comes to things like investigative reporting, you have to just bridge it from online to on chain. Like, okay, if your story was cited in a court case, just show the URL, which is the court documents, and then you can verify it for yourself. So that's where even Ethereum attestation service comes in, that you can actually have crowdsourced evaluation of investigative reporting impact, because a lot of it is online. So that's where those elements would come into. So I think we have a very unique edge in actually, that's it. That this is like the failure which everyone asks, like, okay, how do you know it was actually an impact? And we investigative reporters actually have a good answer to that, unlike the people in the carbon credit space or other allied spaces.
Yeah. And we are at the bleeding edge of this stuff right now. So I think as a good investigative journalist, somebody would want to jump in and dig to the bottom of this and be able to create like a transparent source of money, because that is a problem with journalism, is we don't know where the funding comes from, or maybe we do know and we don't want to say it. And, but all this is at the very start. Like, was it the Wall Street Journal that started out, their first website was just a PDF of the newspaper, and we can only conceptualize what we know, but then it grows into something else, like what you were talking about, earlier, and we start off at this point of familiarity, but then you said, the web turned into, like, journalism turned into this two-way conversation with text and video. Who knows what this will become in the future? And the more people that participate the more that social graph builds up and brings more credibility and weight into each of these impact cases, and the more people that can attest to it. So this is awesome. Do you guys have any closing thoughts? I guess that would qualify as my closing thought.
Yeah, I mean, I'll help you round up the various links and projects we talked about, and we can share those links with any kind of project description or podcast description for when this is published, and then we'll just blast this out on Twitter and Lens. I don't know if JournoDAO has a Farcaster account, but we can do all that. Any other last minute things you wanted to add, Devansh?
Yeah, I think just like for listeners who might not be already involved in the crypto and blockchain space, like some of the things I tell people to do in their first few transactions is like vote for JournoDAO and Voicedeck in Gitcoin rounds. And that can really go a long way in getting us funds to create this new funding structure for journalism. And the second is to also get an ENS name. So that's called Ethereum Naming Service. So that's actually like your identity in the crypto and Web3 world. Which people can search you by, see your transactions, what you're spending. So those are really some of the those are the first few transactions that I'd advise you to make if you enter the Web3 world. Get an ENS, vote in Gitcoin rounds, and once Voicedeck launches, like, give some money to the impacts that you like.
I love that. And I think that's a really good idea. Maybe we can, as JournoDAO, or somebody who just feels inspired, to create like a roadmap for journalists on how the best approach step by step to get into becoming a Web3 journalist would be, So yeah, it's a project for anybody that wants to jump into that. So yeah, Devansh, where can we find you?
Yeah, the best place is Twitter, where I write every day on all of these different mechanisms I'm seeing. It's a very fast evolving space. So I've not even talked about Protocol Guild, which is the newest kid on the block in terms of funding, in like public goods funding. So there's a lot of things going on in the space, and I try to kind of keep people updated on it on Twitter. So my Twitter name is the Devansh Mehta. So that's where you can find me and like stay up to date with whatever my knowledge also is.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you all, and we'll see you next episode. Bye.